Dr. Stefan Neszpor, thank you so much for joining us here on the Science of Psychotherapy podcast. How are you?
Good.
And of course, I'm here, Stefan, Richard. You're not in Australia. Where on earth have you gone?
I've gone to Gabriella Island, which is one of the Gulf Islands just off Vancouver, and about 50 k's outside of Vancouver. Yeah.
And it's a really beautiful area because as we mentioned in the introduction, you were originally from Australia, but you've done your lot of work in various places around the world, and now you're over there in Canada. But the big thing, and we used to talk about it. We've had some great coffees over the years. I remember one down in Black Wattle Bay. We sat there and talked about this thing, the cerebellum. This funny little lumpy thing out the back of us. We've done the article, this beautiful article that you've shared with us in the magazine. Can you tell us a little bit just to get us in the swing? Because I think a lot of people, this will be an introduction, really, sort of, I didn't know the cerebellum was this important. Can you give us a little bit of a historic build-up, and then just some of the nature of why you think this is so important a subject to put forward?
Well, the cerebellum's, at the base of the brain. It's like this little cauliflower nodule at the base of the brain. And when I was a medical student, we were just taught that it was there for vibration sense, and you tested when you tested reflexes, and you tested for. I had this general sense that it had to do with three-dimensionality of things and reflexes. And it was there, it was an important thing, but then it was relegated because it always seemed that these other parts of the brain were much more important, and it didn't really seem to have that much function. But it was only when I left medical school and I got interested in psychotherapy, and I always had this neurophysiological view of things, that I started to see therapists doing really interesting therapy, and they just didn't do talking therapies, and they did therapy in three-dimensional space. And I said, well, what's the organ in the body that has a lot to do with three-dimensional space? And bing, that was the cerebellum. Yeah.
And I think that one of the things that and you triggered my thinking about this over the years, where we become, of course, interested in areas of the brain that do things that are very overt. Your amygdala fires up, and you have this, you get into all this fear and anxiety. Your prefrontal cortex lights up, and you have this regulation. But there are so many areas of the brain that do a lot of activity and are very important, but it's not sort of like they're not sort of heroic and dramatic. And I would think that the cerebellum can fit into that. It happens in the background. It happens underneath. It's foundational, but it is actually something that we can be aware of if we just know it. And that first thing you said is 3D. Can you expand a little bit more on that? Because I know things like NLP, they move people around, and sensory motor, we get them to take actions.
Yeah, well, it's under the radar. And I mean, we've known from the more traditional classical ways of understanding the cerebellum that it's got to do with fine motor and learning procedural things, and it's learning to do systemic tasks, like if you're learning to play the piano or you're learning a procedure, that's sort of laid down in the cerebellum. And we thought, well, that's all it's got to do. But it turns out that there's much more, there's another layer to that. And the thing around that has shifted, because one of the things that we found out was that that it comes into dreaming function, and that it comes into, what was the other area that it came into? It just skipped my mind at the moment.
I know there's emotive reactions and frameworks in the cerebellum activity as well.
Oh, that's what I was thinking of. That we used to think it was just motor functions. That's right. And it's this that we've now realized that the emotional wiring comes into the cerebellum as well. And the other thing that's happened is, from a just simple structural point of view, that we've found that the number of neurons in the cerebellum, there are twice as many neurons in the cerebellum as there are in the cerebrum. And so you've got to start saying, why has this little knob got twice as many neurons as this other big knob? And so people have started asking the questions, well, why has this got an emotional wiring circuit? Why do all the emotional circuits go into this? And why has it got twice as many neurons? And so they've now started to figure out that there's a strong story going on emotionally in the cerebellum. And there's also a strong function when it comes to reworking emotional patterns and reusing patterns, recalibrating patterns. And that leads into what we call template reworking and template formation and template calibration.
So this is a framework where we can see in the brain a sense of emotions and movement having a place where they can interact and integrate, perhaps. But certainly this connection between emotions and movement is very strong in the cerebellum. Is this the...
Well, yeah, let me put it this way. The primary cause of emotion are like this. If this is our primary emotions,
I see a bunch of beautiful ropes there you're hanging on to. Yeah.
There are 4 of them that make us feel good, and there are 3 of them that'll close us down. And there was a scientist that's been working on this, a fellow called Pansep, and he's shown that they primarily arise up in the amygdala hippocampus area in the upper part of the brain, but they send this little knob down through the cerebellum. And this little knob that goes into the cerebellum is where these emotional messages, these emotional templates get reworked. And you've got to say, well, why are they getting sent to the cerebellum to get reworked? Well, if you think that these are procedures, little maps, the reason they're going to the cerebellum to be reworked here is that if the brain were to generate a signal around an emotion, like, say, fear or something, or fright, and it had to send the signal from the cerebellum all the way down to your foot, check the signal out, and then bring it back, that would use a hell of a lot of energy. And that's not a good, efficient use of energy in the body, because the brain is already using 20% of the energy in the body. So what it does, it runs the signal through a simulator. It says, can I do option A? Can I do option B? Or can I do option C? And it works out which option is the best option, which option is the most efficient. And it just runs that through the cerebellum, through a very small circuit, and go boom, and sends the signal down. Now, what's interesting is that it also can do that very efficiently during dreaming. And in dreaming, you don't have the actual motor function going on, which is also conserving energy, because if you had your legs going full ball during your night sleep, you'd consume a lot of your energy. So this can happen at nighttime because your brain puts your motor system into neutral at nighttime, so it can try these different things out in a safe way. And it covers that up at nighttime by putting it into a metaphoric pattern. So it takes it into some procedure that normally your conscious mind can't think of. So it runs it through another pattern for you, tests the template out, and boom, you wake up in the morning with this funny notion of something to do. Now, I'll give you an example of that. While I was preparing this talk, I had all these different ideas running through my head, and I was thinking, oh my God, how am I going to do this? I've got 80, 90 slides. Oh, no, it's gone up to 120. I'm never going to get through all of this. What am I going to be doing? So one night when all these ideas were racing through my head, I thought, I'm never going to be able to pull this together. This is terrible. How am I going to cope? So I went to sleep one night and I'm having this dream. And in this dream, I'm lying in bed and Michelle Obama's lying beside me.
Oh, well done.
Michelle, what are you doing beside me? Obama's going to really get mad at you. What are you doing here? And she says, it's all right, it's all right. And she began to shrink. And then Obama was there and he was running around the other end of the bed. He says, oh, don't worry about it. It's going to go away. And he began to shrink and become quite a small Obama. And he says, come on. And she began to shrink and joined him. And I thought, what a crazy thing to happen. But what was really interesting was the next morning I woke up and I found that I was able to summarize all of those 120 different slides into themes. And I was able to condense the talk into a way that made a lot more sense. And it just fell into place very easily.
Yes,
and I think that was a lovely example of how that template function works.
Yeah, and choosing possibly the people who are iconic of really good ideas and very active and progressive sort of people. But this is so interesting, Stefan. And I know you're championing at the bit, Matt. I just quickly my reflection that because this idea that we have a lot of talk about the basal ganglia with its automatic sort of storage of actions and reactions and thoughts, but they're not templates. They're not alternatives. They're just like the immediate first one, sort of the habitual behaviors and things. This idea that natural inner problem solving that Ernie Rossi and I talk about so much, the cerebellum is a lot of part of this because it allows the body to run templates and practice runs. How fascinating.
Well, that also ties in with the stuff that Pansep talks about. Because if we look at the hierarchy of those 7 emotions, the emotions that open us up to new possibilities, playfulness is at the top of that.
Yes.
Our capacity to play, our capacity to take something that seems difficult or hard and turn it into something new. Interestingly enough, it's very similar to what Piaget talks about. Taking something that's familiar and making it strange again.
Yes.
And it's also it's taking something familiar and making it strange again. And by the time I finished all of that and I started thinking about it, there was that lovely diagram I showed, that wonderful picture of that bridge across the river.
Yes, in the article.
I hope you get to show that. And towards the end, when we looked at that picture at the end, how I was able to see how that was taking the familiar and making it strange and bringing those templates up and reworking all of that and calibrating that and building those templates. And that it was literally like when you looked at that picture, you saw this wonderful picture of nature and this bridge, and we thought the river wasn't that important and it was just the bridge to get one side to the other. But maybe the river was just as important to the ecology of the whole functioning of that ecosystem, because the whole of that ecosystem wouldn't survive without the river. And it's in that sense, it's a little bit like the cerebellum is the sort of underbelly of the brain, because the brain's not going to function without that river, without that underbelly.
And that flow. Yeah.
That flow that feeds that whole system, so the rest of it can also function.
I'm just amazed at, like you said, there's twice as much neural density in the cerebellum as there is in the neocortex, and the fact that that's got a be a flag that something serious is going on here. And as you're talking about, this is a kind of like a virtual playground for the mind to be able to run algorithms of what could possibly happen. And like you said, in dream states. And as you're talking, I'm trying to, remember, my different studies to do with, dreaming and neuroscience. And I don't think there was a lot said about the cerebellum.
Nothing in my studies? No.
Yeah. Have we just missed this?
I don't know that we have, but let me give you another clinical example. I had a couple I was seeing, and they were going into a perpetual argument all the time, and the more they added verbal words into the exchange, they were literally overloading their exchange. And in that exchange, if you actually look at the neurobiology, they're really overloading their verbal processor, and they just had too much information. They couldn't get through to each other. They were literally both in flooding states. They were flooding themselves, going over the same sort of infinity loop. So I asked them to say, well, what was your score out of 10 in terms of your angst or irritation with your partner? Okay, and I don't want you to go into I said, just tell me where you are with this topic, tell me where you are with that topic. I don't want you to tell me the topic. And I said, now I want you to have the conversation with your partner for the next couple of minutes. But instead of talking, I want you to just make sounds with one another and translate the concern as a sort of a noise to each other, and see if you can transmit the irritation without the words. And then check back in to see where you were, to see if that had made any difference. And surprisingly, at the end of that sort of exchange, they had gone from like 7 out of 10 irritations down to 4 out of 10. And one was 8 out of 10 that had gone down to a 4 out of 10. And I think that's kind of, we place a lot of reliance on the verbal exchange as the only way of transacting and reducing stress, whereas sometimes I think we need to change the channel for the exchange, the communication we have between. And I think that's moving out of this kind of what I call this fuse wire communication and bringing it onto broadband. It's changing the channel. And that's right. I said, now I want you to communicate with your partner at the end after this growliness, and I want you to tell your partner how it felt afterwards when you were able to express this message just by touch. So we took something that was familiar, which was yada, 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 using verbal, and changing it to the touch channel. So we changed the signaling process from the verbal channel to a sensory channel.
And also
made contact.
Yes, and it's also motor channel as well. So
yeah, and motor channel. That's right, and movement.
Right.
And connection.
So this is tying the cerebellum in more so. Is that what you're getting at?
That's what I'm getting at. Is that we're trying this different way of using this kind of intervention to try and use this. It's not saying this other stuff doesn't work as well. I think, but there's room for both. It's not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but it's saying, okay, are there other ways that we can add to what we do when it comes to working with people?
And run different templates.
Yeah, different templates. The other thing that I found is that it's much less stressful working that way as a therapist. It's much more akin to being playful with folk and being attuned to them and being in a place where there's a sense of being playful with them, sort of having what's called Spielraum, sort of a freeing space with them.
This also ties in just with the ideas of broaden and build, Barbara Fredrickson's, that those expansive, more the playful, those drives that Panksepp talked about, it's in the toward vibes drives, tend to expand you and open you out. And of course that offers you, and so we can utilize those lovely, this expansiveness that's within, or the template nature, or the alternative nature in the cerebellum. So that's a really good example of that. And it's interesting that expansiveness relaxes us quite often.
Yeah,
it's not a golden rule, depends on the circumstances, but by shifting it from just the rigidity of language, by moving it into then just sound and non-specific, and then into touch, they actually managed to be able to find a calmness. That's interesting too.
I'm wondering, just sort of, I might be going off on a bit of a tangent here, but the cerebellum is lateralized, like the main left and right hemispheres. Is there, are there differences then in the left and right cerebellum in what we're talking about?
I'm not aware of that. But what was interesting, just prior to you guys coming on, I was watching something on YouTube, and it was talking about one of the tricks for if you want to increase your memory. One of them, I think, if your right hand, if you want to learn better, you squeeze your right hand, and if you want to recall, you squeeze your left hand.
Right.
So that's kind of touched in with that. There's also some stuff around with a technique I found particularly helpful, and I'm not sure whether it's directly tied in with cerebellum, but it is tied in with the release of oxytocin, which is a technique called havening. Which is that technique of doing that with breathing. And I found that particularly helpful, particularly during the COVID experience, where people, when I was working in the outpatients department with Island Health, and there were a lot of people experiencing social isolation, particularly in anxiety states and some of the borderline folk. And that turned out to be quite soothing for a number of them. Because it tied them into breathing. It also gave them a sense of being able to self-soothe their bodies and bring them into a place of being with themselves.
Is that a type of bilateral stimulation? That sort of.
Well, I imagine. I mean, if we look at it, I know the reading, and I can send you the article if you haven't seen the article that talks about how that sort of this sort of behavior, and that sort of behavior, and this sort of stimulation with breath leads to quite strong oxytocin release. And I would imagine that's got movement tied in with it. And because it's bilateral and there's movement, that's also going to have a link to cerebella as well as some cortical stuff.
Something that's a little bit interesting about Dev, for those who are just listening, what Stefan did was he worked his hands on the side of the face, but he also crossed the hands working on the shoulders. And there's also a part of that work which is a using of the hands and the upper thighs instead of the legs. Yeah. And what is very interesting is that the insula, which is about our sense of interoception, has got a high degree of sensitivity in the areas of the shoulder and the upper arms and the top thigh. And the hands have got a very high sense of outgoing framework. So really, by the outgoing energy of the hands going to stimulating the inward energy of the insula has this beautiful calming effect. And Asperger's and autistics very often are seen doing that calming, but also we do it ourselves when we are hyperactive and hyper anxious. But it's a wonderful, and so Havening has perhaps discovered it independently, just by their own observations. But it is a beautiful natural thing that we've seen, and you actually can go back to some of the Egyptian things, and you'll see quite a lot of that where they've got the arms crossed onto the shoulders with holding a religious item of power. So I think this what always fascinates me is that our body has known, and our body's been into this to itself for a long, long time, but it does take a while for us to embrace the different elements of it, as we're doing here now with the cerebellum, which is a bit of a new story.
Well, I think our bodies, there are various practices all through time where we've been able to do things. It's just that we're now developing the science of finding some of these things out. Like, for instance, one of the things that I found out, which was really interesting when it came to Harlow's monkeys, many of us learnt, that the monkeys like to be close to were given the choice between food, or the cloth object that could nurture them, chose the cloth object that could nurture them. And often wondered, well, whatever happened to those monkeys? And then I came across a book called The 3-Pound Universe. And when you read into there's a wonderful chapter in that book that talks about they looked at the monkeys and followed them up. And it showed how they did EEGs on those monkeys. And it showed that there was very strong kindling in the brains of those monkeys. And the kindling went from their limbic system to their cerebellum. And there was this strong limbic cerebellar link, And I thought, oh, okay. So, and that's when I then started to look at, well, what else gets linked to the cerebellum? And that's when I found out about the psychiatric disorder links. And I started looking at some of the journal items there, and I noticed there are strong links with schizophrenia, anxiety disorders, and some of the different lobes tend to be clustered in some of the different lobes in the cerebellum.
Yes, we've got a nice image of that in the article where you give an indication that there's this midline type of set of activities, and then these are also represented in the two lobes. And you also describe that there's a degree of differentiation between the different areas. In the anterior aspects of it, you've got a sort of that's more motor oriented, and in the vermis, the sort of if you could explain just that term, the vermis, but that's more affective. But then in the posterior, more cognitive and empathetic.
Yeah. So if you kind of steamrolled the cerebellum out, it's like the front part has to do more with the anxiety aspects of things going on in the cerebellum. The mid part has to do it with anxiety and pain and other emotions, whereas the posterior part has to do with more cognitive things, more thinking parts, and more things around empathy. So all those emotional things that I talked about earlier, where those streams run into the cerebellum and out again. And so that's where all those templates run into the different parts of the cerebellum, and those empathy pathway or those template pathways get worked on and come back out again.
Yeah. So just to emphasize that, this is a place of reference of running running algorithms, I guess, or maps, as you said, to give feedback then back to the neocortex, and then to, I guess, then if it's an emotion, then or a motor response, then from the cortex through motor neurons, then to the rest of the body.
Yeah,
am I getting that right? That
I think so. But the other thing that's starting to emerge is that, remember, one of the other things that I talked about is what I think the old version we had is this sort of this structuralism view of the cortex, where we said, this is the motor cortex, this is the sensory motor cortex, this is the occipital cortex. We're now starting to think of neural function areas or neural networks. And I think there are like about 7 kind of primary networks, and they each have specific functions that, like, you've got the prefrontal cortex, and you've got the visual cortex, and you've got a salient network, and you've got the default neural networks. And all of these networks have different functions, but they all function with one another. And there's a certain functionality in having them be close to one another so that they can send messages to one another quickly. And there's a certain efficiency. It's like when governments set up hubs to function in different regions. In the city, you'll have they'll set up a hub in a port area, and they'll set up a hub in an outer city area, and they'll have a hub in another. And there's certain functionality, and the brain does similar things like that. It makes sense that these hubs function very effectively. And we're now getting to the point where we're starting to be able to think about assessing those hubs and those hubs' functions. And we're thinking in terms of how do we assess those hubs, and not only just through fMRIs, but also through electromagnetic visualizations and caps that you can wear to get an idea of just exactly what's going on in someone's brain.
Yeah, certainly the network perspective is so important when we look at lesions in either the left or right hemisphere. A lesion in one little particular area, it doesn't just impact geographically, just around that area. It can have far-reaching implications because you're cutting a network as opposed to just creating some damage in a little local area. So
Yes, and which is the negative impact we have with certainly strokes, but also with the TIAs, the transient ischemic attacks, just where you get a small area of the brain damage, but it can have a dramatic effect on broader network-based activities, which is. And I was just sort of thinking too, and I'm really speculating here, so apologies for that. I may be completely off the mark, but one of the things that Matt and I for years have sort of said, the idea of an old brain, a newer brain, and then the very new cortex as separate entities is kind of misleading, even though they certainly do have that age of development, but they've integrated. So it may well be that the cerebellum in earlier species and earlier areas of evolution was very simple and was very much related to just simple things. But the body doesn't just, the evolutionary development and change allows things to expand and develop and integrate new things, which clearly the cerebellum has been doing for a long time, and we haven't been paying attention to it.
Well, the other thing, it's interesting once you start reading into this, the bits and pieces you pick up. One of my colleagues was telling me, he said the cerebellum has connections to every joint, to every Golgi system in your body. Your Golgi system tests all the muscle strains in your body. The other thing is all of that is set up before you are born.
Wow.
Cerebellum pathways are set into your body before you're born. All that hard wiring is done in utero. So, which is quite an incredible piece of wiring. to think that, you know, when we develop and when we're born, that whole system gets set up into a human who, you know,
pretty fundamental,
hardwired like that.
Yeah, the limbic area tends to be done in utero, but certainly it's an engaged. I mean, we've really tapped into this thing, and sure, now we've scratched the surface of where we could go. But I think for this exposure now and this discussion now, and you know, we'll definitely have some more in time to come, Stefan. I just wonder if there's, as we round it out, if there's something we've particularly missed that you want to put in, or whether it's just if you've got some sort of rounding words of wisdom to leave us with as we consider this fabulous unthought of part of the brain.
I think it just invites us to be open to the idea of, you know, that our brains are unfolding pieces of tissue that are not fixed entities, that they're capable of development, and if we kind of provide the right kind of stimulus to them, we can develop them, we can harness them, and even very simple everyday tasks can lead us to ways of harnessing ourselves in different ways, and novelty is one of the tools we can use. Like I remember one of the things that surprised me was when I had a whole lot of furniture to put together when I first reached my house here. I had a whole lot of IKEA furniture, and I started working on different tasks, and I got through one piece of furniture and did 3/4 of it and stopped for 15 minutes, and then started on another piece, did 3/4 of it, stopped for 15 minutes. And I must have had about 8 or 9 projects like that. And I thought, what on earth am I doing here? And then the next morning, and I was literally exhausted at the end of the day, went to sleep. And the next morning I went boom, 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 and finished off about eight projects very quickly. And it was only when I reflected afterwards, why did that work so well, that I realized that I only had attention for the task for a certain amount of time. And then I needed some new novelty, some new stimulus to motivate myself to do a new task. And by keeping the novelty going, I was able to push myself through the task. And that provided, and that made the whole thing more playful and helped me sort of get a sense of being able to get through a demanding experience. And so I think if we take tasks and we break it down and introduce novelty into it, chunking things down, you can move forward with things.
And we are likely to have fascinating things going on in fascinating areas of our brain, including the fascinating cerebellum. Stefan, thank you so much for your time today. This has given everybody lots of food for thought. Rush off, go read the article in the January issue, and that's another step forward. And then there's a whole bunch of reference points, and you're given some extra reading. It's terrific.
Yeah, fantastic.
Okay.
Thanks, Stefan.
Thank you.